Dinner with the King. Written by naturalbornderpy. I heard he makes them eat glass.
Why would he do that?
I dunno, 'cause he can, I guess.
I can't see that happening.
The pegasus that had been invited to dinner watched the steady shadows of two ponies splayed out along a wall through the open door. If they had thought they were out of earshot, they had been terribly mistaken. Instead of trying to tune them out or go somewhere else, the pegasus only lowered his head to rest back on his hooves. It had been a position he'd been keeping since his name was read aloud in front of everyone. That must have been less than 20 minutes ago already, which left him
less than an hour.
He finished for himself. They read your name, and an hour later they come to collect you. Any more time than that and ponies would be more willing to try something brash. Many still did. But escape from the Empire had always been a delusional pipe dream, and nothing more. Nothing of interest lay beyond those overbearing walls, the stallion knew. That's what the king had told them on far more than a single occasion. The pegasus readjusted his head and glared at the dozens of empty cots in the wide room he was occupying. On any other moment, on any other day, more than half of those beds would have been loaded with worn and tired ponies, crashing for a spell before the next swifts in their regions. Those with enough energy would sometimes hold hushed conversations between bedmates. Only now was the stallion oddly alone in the room. Not many wanted to see him that day. Not when there was a good chance they would never see him again. It had all started several years ago. King Sombra had requested the attendance of 6 citizens of the Crystal Empire for a feast at his castle. 6 white, hoof-written letters with a melted candle wax seal bearing the king's likeness went out to the masses. Neither one of the 6 knew of the other. None was of much higher or lower social class than the other, although no one in the Empire was truly above the king. The invited 6 went with worry in their hearts, but curiosity above all. Seldom few were ever allowed within the walls of the castle, instead being left to imagine what lay beyond those crystal peaks, as their king would make his speeches high up on his overhanging ledge. 6 left for dinner, and 1 returned. The one that came back never spoke a word of what had happened to the others, nor was he the same following that night. And instantly, an evening with the king took on a far more horrifying form. On the last day of every month, 6 more letters were sent to the terrified populace. Always random, always without a single ounce of semblance were the subjects picked. Only on a lone occasion did a whole family of 6 go before the king. The only one to return was the unicorn father, with sudden red and swollen eyes, a mouth that hung limp and mumbled constantly. Less than a week later, he walked off a tall scaffolding in the far reaches of the mine, perhaps in a bid to return to the rest of his family. That had been the only trace of a pattern. Ever since, it had been random selections once more. When the letters were sent to individuals, most were destroyed or hidden away. When ponies tasked with bringing them to the castle came to collect, they were adamantly told they had the wrong building, and the wrong name as well. Since such negligence would never sit well with the king, more than a few fights broke out, and a bloodied and bruised guest would be given over for dinner. On a few occasions, when the invited individual proved a tad bigger than the ponies tasked with delivering them, the drivers would then pick ponies at random from the streets, usually the ones too frail to put up much resistance.
Violet Song, Brass Steed.
It only took a few months before the invitations were collected before going out. 1 hour before that evening's dinner would commence, the 6 names would be read for the entire Empire to hear. When more than a few thought the ponies controlling the reading of the names might be placing other names into the mix, the announcer himself inadvertently uttered his own name before realizing what he had done. He was never heard from again. 6 ponies went with the promise of a feast to remember forever. A single guest returned, forever changed, forever scarred. But not a single one would say a word of what happened. The Pegasus sitting in wait on his thin bed shuddered when he heard the clop of hooves just outside his clouded window. One of the 6 simple brown chariots that came to scoop up each guest in tow had finally made its way to him.
Had it been an hour already?
He thought bitterly. From under his mattress, he picked up the thin and jagged knife he'd stolen from the communal kitchen only minutes after his name had been announced. Along the blade, he viewed his worn and sunken eyes as he held it aloft. He wondered if he'd be allowed close enough to him to be able to use such an instrument. He then wondered if he'd be searched before meeting him. There was a lot left to chance, but perhaps there was another way. Tossing the knife back to the bed for whoever wanted it after he was gone, the Pegasus trotted out the door and to the entrance before the king's staff bothered to knock. When he entered the hall outside his room, more than a few quiet conversations came to a disparaging halt. He didn't bother to stare at anyone, or try to make them feel worse than they might. He had never honestly gotten to know a single one of them, so why should he thrash out at them just because the opportunity was available? A few steps from the front door, and suddenly he was wrapped in a set of legs. The owner was a mare much younger than him, a delicate shine in both big eyes.
You might get lucky, you know.
She told him sincerely.
You might be the one that comes back. I'd really like it if you did.
The Pegasus had seen her around their cozy cramped lodge more than a few times, but couldn't place her name. Instead of crushing what little spirit remained by saying, "I don't think so," he rather ruffled her mane while displaying a smile that felt as false as it must have looked. He couldn't help but stop his jaw from quivering.
I'm here to pick up.
The Pegasus held out a hoof for him to stop where he was. The unicorn with a small clipboard held in one hoof glanced at him briefly before averting his eyes. That would be the last time he'd look at him. Without another word, the Pegasus climbed aboard the small carriage and shut the door behind him. Since the back seat had been designed to carry more than a single pony, he leaned back and sprawled out along the unyielding seat, just giving his head enough space to glimpse the fading sun in the sky. As much as he tried to block out the tall walls that threatened to nip at the sunset's simple beauty, the Pegasus just wasn't up to the task. He was still in the king's domain, and he'd be reminded of it until the day he died. And there was a good chance that would be tonight. Or perhaps something worse than death lay in store for him. The gentle rocking of the carriage nearly sent him to sleep, but the trip was short enough that by the final stop he was up in an instant. The unicorn that had trotted them there unhooked himself from the carriage and came around to open the door. It looked as though he wanted to say a few words, maybe a few to make the situation seem less bleak than it clearly was, but gave up before even beginning. As the Pegasus climbed down, the driver still averted his eyes. The Pegasus whistled.
Here is too.
He craned his neck to glimpse the mammoth tower of multicolored crystal before him, ending with its many sparkling, sharp peaks. He had seen it every day of his miserable life, but this was the closest he'd ever been to it, and now he'd get to go inside its unknowing walls. The Pegasus turned to the unicorn standing idle by his ride.
What's going to happen in there?
He asked him. The unicorn rubbed a foreleg against the other.
I don't know.
He said faintly.
You lying or trying to save your own skin?
I really don't know.
The unicorn's voice somehow lowered even more.
But just know that.
That you're sorry?
The Pegasus cut in briskly.
That you feel terrible? Or save it? It's easy for you to say such things now. You don't have to be me. You don't have to go and eat with the king. But you know what? I'm pretty famished if I do say so myself. I think I've felt that way for close to my entire life now. So maybe if Sombra's willing to give me some good food before I go away forever, then maybe that'll be just peachy. Maybe that'll be quite the way to go. What do you make of that notion?
The unicorn stopped rubbing his legs together and lowered his head. It would have to do for an answer.
That's fine.
The Pegasus continued.
I'm probably late as it is.
He trotted towards the open set of doors that fed into a richly decorated hallway. Once he crossed the threshold and entered the dimness of the hall and the small lamps that hung every few meters along the walls, 2 sentries from outside pushed the doors shut. The Pegasus did not bother to view the outside world one final time. He had never liked it that much anyways. Only when he heard the clean snap of the doors connecting again did he fall to the floor and cry. It had been a rising sensation edging its way throughout his body since the carriage had left his home and taken him there. In the overwhelming view of the public eye, and in the silent scrutiny of his unicorn driver, he had merely let those feelings take hold, all while he remained as visibly rigid as he could. But now that he was alone, now that he was here, and there was no possible way of turning back, did he let himself become swallowed whole by those welling emotions. No family was left to mourn for him. Few friends would miss him when he was gone. He had a mission he had hastily placed upon himself, so even if he was that lucky last surviving guest, he was in no means going to leave this place tonight. He would finish his foolhardy mission, because it could only benefit everyone in the Empire, and if he died doing so, he would perish a proud pony. He could speak all the tough words he could fathom to as many of Sombra's drones as he could, and yet never hold a single one of them responsible for what was about to unfold tonight. Orders were just orders. He could feel all these things and accept them as they were, but underneath it all he was scared. Underneath it all he was still just a normal pony with normal feelings. And suddenly he did not want to die that night. Or whatever it was that happened to a good majority of Sombra's guests. So while curled up in a ball on the red-carpeted floors, he bawled like a filly. Until someone poked him in the ribs. Guest number 5. The Pegasus on the floor stopped shuddering and glared at the earth pony that had just prodded him. He didn't bother to try and hide what he had obviously been doing moments ago. Unlike the unicorn from before, this servant of the king bore no sympathetic expression to be found. This one only looked weary and almost bored. It was close to refreshing from the sea of sorrow that ran rampant in most streets of the Empire.
He must be used to the sight of tears.
The Pegasus thought.
He must have seen it all, as ponies begged and screamed and tried for any means of escape. What a terrible job you must have. What a terrible boss you must work for.
Guest number 5, he said again, not exactly a question or a statement. The Pegasus hastily wiped his moistened cheeks and got to his hooves.
What's that now?
From here on in, you will be guest number 5, the Earth Pony said monotone. The king has never been the type to learn the names of others. Follow me, if you'd be so kind. Before he turned his back to him, the Pegasus,
Or I guess number 5.
he thought bluntly, glimpsed a small tag on the corner of the pony's immaculate suit jacket. He thought it read, Greeter number 5, but he couldn't be certain. With nothing left to interject with, he followed him down the hall, both sets of hooves barely making a sound against the plush carpet. How many times had he even touched such material? How many carpeted areas even existed in the Empire? The Pegasus had scarcely a clue. Their trip was long and silent, as they carefully climbed a seemingly never-ending curve of red-carpeted stairs, ascending and ascending until the very notion of just how high they must be felt completely lost on the Pegasus. Eventually they came to another door, where his greeter halted by its side with a hoof gently resting on the knob. He didn't make motion to enter, only held onto it delicately. With another leg he reached into a jacket pocket to retrieve a watch. For the rest of their time together, he viewed its ticking face with increasing interest. When the silence ran a little too long, the Pegasus asked him,
Any tips?
The Earth Pony still studied his gold watch ardently. Not really. You might have a tiny bit better chance with a set of wings and all. But then again I might be lying. 30 more seconds carefully ticked by. Only fate, chance and luck will see you through. He continued indifferently. That is, if you believe in such things. Otherwise, I bid you goodbye. He pushed open the door as he shut his pocket watch with a snap. Instead of watching him enter, he redirected his interest to the narrow hall behind them. It was back to business as usual, it seemed.
I'll make sure to save you some dessert.
The Pegasus snorted before he entered the dining room. He hadn't known what to expect, so the fact that it appeared like the dining room of his dreams did little to sway the acidy bile steadily rising in his stomach. The room was larger than most he'd ever been in, oval in shape, every inch of the floor hidden beneath more red carpets and lavish large rugs. 8 tall, floor-to-ceiling windows circled the vast room. The sun had disappeared some time ago, so each only gave way to darkened clouds and a brilliantly bright full moon. If the hundreds of stairs hadn't given it away before, the view certainly did. They must have been near the very top of the Crystal Empire Tower. Dozens of lit candles held on sconces sent out small rays of yellow curving light to different areas of the room. Still, with that many light sources, black pockets of shadows remained close to everywhere. The Pegasus honestly pondered if a certain king enjoyed it that way. The long dining table waited at the very center of the room, cut from some monstrous cherry-red tree, and varnished and polished until it shone. The 7 chairs adorning it were made of the same material. In front of each chair was an identical set of silver plates with utensils, twinkling from the many flickering candles on the walls. 3 chairs sat on both sides of the rectangular table. A 7th chair, sat directly in front of a roaring fire pit, had been placed at its head. No plate or utensils of any kind were waiting to be used. While the other 6 chairs stood empty and waiting, the chair before the fire had already been filled. King Sombra sat patiently, while bits of wood crackled and splintered just behind him. 2 dark hooves were held together on the table. Even from such a distance away, the Pegasus could make out his trademark red cape and curved silver crown, as well as that monstrous blood-red horn. If it was real or just for show, he had always wondered. Maybe tonight he'd ask, if given the chance. That was when another odd detail came to the Pegasus. His king was without his great and shiny armor as well. Only a tied length of red cloth hung around his neck.
Sombra in casual wear?
He reluctantly contemplated.
Well, it's just dinner, isn't it?
As much as he wanted to joke his way to feeling a slight modicum better, the simple sight of the king only made him want to reconnect with the ground and form himself into the tightest of balls. Countless times he had glimpsed him while he made his long-winded speeches from up on high, but now he was near, so near, and he was so much more real than ever before, and maybe more vulnerable. Sombra had his attention fixed on the opposite wall. Another stallion, clearly another guest by the way his eyes bulged out from their sockets, stood stock still in front of the shut door he had just been led through. The Pegasus watched as the guest spun around and tried to head back the way he'd entered. Obviously, the door had been locked. Finally, the Pegasus noted the other 5 guests standing idle in front of their own sealed entrances. While most of them were still busy with the process of taking in the rest of the room, or Sombra himself, another was already trying his best to plough his shoulder through the door. The door in question didn't waver an inch. In between hammering thrusts, the Pegasus noted his bruised lip and swollen eye. It must have been quite the fight that finally brought him here.
Please, be seated.
Sombra's voice cut through the room like a rock slide in a mine. Those that hadn't noticed him until then sucked in a good mouthful of air, while a unicorn mare by another door literally screamed out loud. It was likely she couldn't help it. It took close to 2 minutes before every guest carefully peeled themselves away from their doors. Any access they could provide outwards had been removed the moment they shut. Now all that remained was dinner. The Pegasus slowly trotted towards the lavish table, a small part of him still intrigued by its simple elegance and beauty. Hundreds in the Empire starved each day or worked themselves close to death, all while their king sat in his tall tower to toy with his subjects. All the while lush meals were served to him from the hooves of others. The Pegasus was happy to find a serrated knife along with their other utensils. When he approached the table, he glossed over the large numbers stamped at the top of each chair, 1 through 6, in a rich silver colour, crisscrossing from the open end of the table all the way to the seated Sombra. Spots 1 and 2 sat the furthest away from him, while 5 and 6...
Oh no. I'm seated right next to him.
The Pegasus's breathing quickened.
Only a few feet from him. Barely a leg's reach.
But hadn't he come here with the sole intention of getting close to the king? The first one to take their seat was the only other Pegasus in the room, an older mare, guest number 3. With barely a glance at the king, she scooted out her chair and sat down without hesitation. Her eyes looked worn and had a far-away appearance, as though she was staring at something completely different from the rest of them.
She looks as though this was any other meal.
The Pegasus thought, pulling out his own chair to the right of her.
She must have lost it completely. Scared herself out of her mind. I should have thought about bashing my head in with a rock before coming in. At least I could smile and draw and perhaps feel a bit better if Sombra did whatever he planned on doing to us.
The mare pried her napkin from under her knife and fork and set it on her lap. It was such a simple move, and yet in such a place it felt off. Guest number 5 instantly pitied her above the rest, and already she had said something to him. He turned to her.
Sorry, what was that?
She smiled warmly.
I said you remind me of my son. He's a Pegasus too, about your age.
While the stallion could think of no sensible rebuttal, he could hardly leave the older mare without acknowledgement. He nodded hurriedly.
That's nice.
Straight away he thought of a do-over.
I hope you make it out of here, then.
He added awkwardly, instantly hating each word as it left his mouth.
Grim talk in a grim place.
He thought coldly.
You can't escape it.
Since there was honestly no other place to go, each of the other 4 guests slowly found their seats. Guest number 1 at the edge of the table was a male earth pony, as were guests 4 and 6 seated on the other side of the table. Guest number 4 was the bruised and bloodied bigger stallion, with a definite chip on his shoulder. Before finding his place, he looked under both his chair and the table for possible traps, before bringing each piece of silverware close to his eye for inspection. He then sniffed each of them with his nose, although the Pegasus didn't believe it would be as simple as that. The only other mare, seated at the outer edge, ended up also being the only unicorn in the group. Tightly bunched in her seat, she visibly trembled while she scarcely lifted her head away from her silver plate. Perhaps she thought if she concentrated hard enough, it would turn into a portal that she could jump through and away. Or perhaps not.
Thank you all for joining me this evening.
A smooth, low voice told them all. Having completely forgotten about the dark stallion with a crown atop his head seated only a leg's reach from him, guest number 5 shuddered from the sudden sound. Sombra's low timbre cut through the deadly silent room with relative ease. But then again, he must have done this dozens of times by now.
I hope you've all brought your appetites with you.
Sombra continued, the rest of his body completely motionless while his red and green eyes steadily surveyed each one of them in turn. Only did guest number 3, the older mare by his side, meet his studious glare. The Pegasus, along with the rest, shied away at the last possible moment.
I have personally brought in what might be some of your favourite delicacies for the occasion. I honestly can't tell you how much I've been looking forward to tonight.
While Sombra spoke and fixed his gaze somewhere else, guest number 5 eyed the king warily. It was an odd experience to glimpse a legend in such close quarters. Part of him didn't even seem real, as though the thoughts and stories you told yourself in your head could never quite match what actually existed. Besides the bizarre eyes, and the possibly fake red horn, the king of the empire looked about as normal as any other dark stallion.
Well, perhaps any stallion that forgets to cut their mane every few weeks.
But what the Pegasus found oddest of all was the lack of purple smoke dispersing near the edges of his eyes. Although he had only viewed the king from meters away while he spoke to the entire empire, he could have sworn he saw such an anomaly. Or was that merely just another story blown up by the mouths of hundreds, perhaps in a bid to add more menace to their already sadistic king? Regardless, guest number 5 was happy to find such a flourishing detail missing. Sombra continued.
You all appear so nervous to dine with me. I wish it were not so. I only offer you food tonight, possibly the best you've ever had.
He raised his head to gently sniff at the air.
And it already smells wonderful in here.
Since sitting down, the Pegasus hadn't registered a single thing besides a constant burning wood smell emitting from the fire. Not had a single aroma touched his snout. So what was Sombra smelling, exactly?
Let's begin.
With his horn, Sombra levitated a small bell near the corner of the table. He jingled it a single time and then set it back down. Less than a few seconds later, a pair of doors from some unseen corner of the dim room flew open, and a pair of serving ponies in matching attire came marching out. One held a pitcher of what must have been water, while the other held one filled with something red, bordering on purple. Without a word, the pair went around the 6 of them, filling the 2 glasses in front of each guest with one of both liquids. Once they departed, the Pegasus sniffed at his water glass before doing the same to the reddish one. He thought it smelled of rotten grapes mixed with a strong alcohol, but couldn't put his hoof on it. He'd had grapes on possibly 2 occasions during his life. Such delicacies were a rare treat to be found in the Empire.
Have any of you tried wine before?
Sombra asked them pleasantly.
I hear it's a wonderful alternative to harsher alcohols, and quite cumbersome to find as well.
Before a single guest could try either of their libations, the same set of ponies did another round and set a silver dome before each of them. In the small amount of time before they unveiled what was being kept beneath, the Pegasus couldn't help but remember what those ponies from his home had muttered outside his door.
And here comes the glass.
He thought dourly.
All the poison, all the blades, all the who knows what.
Underneath the polished steel dome was a steaming bowl of vegetable soup. Large chunks of fresh produce swam in a thin but overwhelmingly savoury broth. With the lid pulled away, the aroma found him instantly, and wouldn't let go. Already his stomach rumbled, and he found an odd amount of saliva in his mouth. For untold days he had been close to starving, and now the richest and most tempting of foods had been placed in front of him. He was expected to eat, although he knew he could not. After each guest first jumped from what might lay in wait under their domes, they then carefully watched each of the others, individually trying to figure out which direction to go.
A simple soup to start,
The king told them happily.
with some of the freshest ingredients to be found.
Guest number 4 with the bruised eye roughly stuck a spoon in and lifted it back up, letting the chunks of potato and vegetable splatter back into the bowl. He turned to Sombra.
You expect me to eat this?
The king looked unperturbed.
Yes, I do.
Guest number 4 said.
Even when you're not eating?
The faintest of grins touched Sombra's lips.
I don't eat food like you do. I find nourishment from other means, much more scarcely found things.
Oddly, that doesn't fill me with much hope.
Guest number 4 shot back. Sombra said no more and turned to the rest, watching curiously. The silence in the room spun out until the older mare by the Pegasus's side first drank from her wine cup before steadily diving into her steaming bowl. Before each bite from her hovering spoon, she gently blew on the broth in a bid to cool it down.
She must imagine she's at home.
Guest number 5 believed.
Home with her son, and whoever else might be waiting there.
Each guest viewed her with restrained wonder. They were all waiting for the darkness to come into the scene. It had to have been coming. They knew it was. But in what form? In what way? A minute passed. Then another. And now the mare's soup had been finished clean as she dabbed the corners of her mouth with the edge of a napkin. As she stared at her empty bowl, a light smile found her deeply lined face. It did look like good soup. When nothing of worry happened to the mare, the bruised stallion across the table roughly plucked up his own wineglass.
Who cares anymore, right? We're all doomed anyways.
Spilling a substantial amount, he downed his drink in one large pull before slamming it back down. The clash of metal made more than a few of them squirm in their seats.
Well, that was good.
He shouted to the room.
How about another?
Guest number 4 lowered his head to his bowl and loudly gulped it down. With both hooves he brought the bowl up until he returned it back to the table empty. Still with a mouthful of chewy proteins, it appeared as though he was close to choking. After a few tough swallows later did he open his mouth again, to sigh contentedly.
What's coming next?
He asked, to no one in particular. That was the tiny display that most had been waiting for. In just a few movements, and with just a few choice words, guest number 4 had practically summed up the entire situation. Already they were there. Already any hope of escape had been sealed off by locked doors and dozens of walls of thick crystal. The only way out now was forward. And forward could only mean... The Pegasus brought his spoon to his soup and picked out a few choice vegetables. With a severe tightness in his chest, he popped its warm contents into his mouth and swallowed thickly, as part of his throat almost tried to close in on him. A few more spoonfuls and an odd sensation entered his belly. One of contentment and something more. Joy, perhaps? It was hard to tell. He whispered to himself.
Nowhere else but forward.
Before ditching his spoon in favour of bringing the warm bowl to his lips. The rich flavours and hints of spice made his eyes nearly water. He had never experienced something so good in all his life, and how odd it was that he'd be receiving such a treat on his last day of it all. But everyone deserves a good last meal. The Pegasus licked what broth remained on his lips and lowered his bowl back down to his plate. He finally regarded the rest of the guests, and found nearly everyone either finishing their soups or close to it. The wall had been broken, and they were passing through, whether by their own will or by that of their deprived stomachs. Every guest but one. The unicorn mare in the far corner only trembled where she sat, head bent, studiously studying the steaming bowl in front of her. Maybe she thought no one would notice. She had been sadly mistaken.
Is there something wrong with your soup, guest number 2?
Sombra asked her, glimpsing her with increased interest.
While everyone else is enjoying their meal, you only sit and shake. You're being rather impolite, especially when your king is being so generous.
His statement did nothing to quell the unicorn. Instead, she only shook more violently while she fretfully scanned the faces of the rest of the guests. If she was looking for some saviour, she would find none here. If she was looking for answers, she had dismally been given the same deck of cards as them all. When the last guest finished their soup, all eyes fell upon her. Even Sombra leaned forward a little in his seat, the edge of one lip pulling up to reveal a single sharp tooth. Already he was having fun. When the silence and the attention bore itself too strongly for the unicorn, she huffed out a shaky breath and plucked up her spoon with jittering hooves. To the Pegasus seated a ways away, it almost looked as though someone had asked her to eat acid, instead of some delicious soup with fresh carrots and herbs. The soup entered her quivering mouth and left clean. For close to 20 seconds she held the contents in her mouth before gulping it down. Gingerly, she set her spoon back on her napkin.
I'm done.
She squeaked. Hardly a statement.
No, you are not.
Returned the king, a little thicker than before.
You are in my home, and I will see that you are fed properly. Before the next course can arrive, every dish must be completed wholly.
He tried his best to smile at her. His smile was the type that didn't add much humility to the rest of his face. His piercing eyes rarely blinked.
I can almost hear your stomach from here, guest number 2. Why must you deny yourself such a wonderful meal?
The unicorn mare did as she was bid, and brought her spoon back to the bowl. Again she glanced at them all. Again nothing of any use came of it. Less than a minute later had she cleaned her bowl. By that time her shakes had abated, and she breathed in not nearly such a hurried fashion. One of her hooves still anxiously rubbed the napkin near her fork.
Was the soup to your liking, my subjects?
The king asked them. No one bothered to answer him with words. Each only nodded eagerly.
Then for that, I am glad.
His smile widened. Renewed excitement filled his eyes. The Pegasus seated next to him felt his up until then warm stomach grow cold. Their king was waiting for something. Something bad. Something was about. The unicorn in the corner gripped her napkin with force before she brought up both hooves to her neck as she struggled for air. Both eyes bulged horrendously outwards as she flew into spasms against her hardwood chair. In one horrendous motion, she slammed her emaciated chest into the narrow table, a large cough spilling dozens of droplets of blood onto her bowl, and nearly reaching the awestruck stallion sitting across from her. After this, the mare only went headfirst into her empty bowl, where she did not move again. An overwhelming silence followed. The next voice to speak was that of the king's.
How it seems, I always neglect to mention it.
He said casually.
The completion of each course will lead to a single, solitary death. I assure you, completely at random. 5 courses for 6 guests. At the end of the meal, the last one alive will get to leave here tonight.
He rang the little bell by his side.
Next course.
He yelled.